All right, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, everyone. We're going to begin the program. I'm so glad to have you all join us as other people join in. My name is Axel Tkach. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Interreligious Studies. The journal is co-published by Hebrew College, Harvard International University, and Boston University School of Theology, Theology and Ministry. And we're very glad to be working with co-produced religions on this programming. Our other sponsor who's going to share their work in today's. A little bit of a rundown. We'll introduce some speakers. We'll have a keynote address followed by 2 case studies, historical case studies, and then some Jewish, Christian, and Muslim responses, after which we'll go to a breakout session and then have a Q&A at the end. So it's a lengthy program packed with a lot of great stuff. And so we're looking forward to it all. So I will get started by, moving on to Sarah Islam, who's going to introduce herself, please, first, and then everyone else very briefly here. Thank you.
Thank you, Axel. I'm Sarah Islam. I'm a postdoctoral fellow with the Co-Produced Religions Project. Today, four of my colleagues, also postdoctoral fellows in the Co-Produced Religions Project, will be presenting their papers, co-authored papers. Maureen Attali, Jillian Stinchcomb, Shlomo Zuckier, and David Gyllenhaal. Responding to their papers will be Adam Gregerman from St. Joseph's University, Rachel Slutsky from Seton Hall University, Laylatul Fitria from Claremont School of Theology, Mohammed Gamal from University of Bristol, Marianne Moyart from the University of Leuven, and Klaus von Stosch from the University of Bonn. And starting us off will be Katharina Heyden from the University of Bern and David Nirenberg from the Institute for Advanced Study, who are the co-directors of the Co-Produced Religions Project.
So let me first say how grateful we are to Axel and the Journal of Interreligious Studies for inviting us to present our collaborative work on the co-production of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam today, and to discuss it with theologians from all 3 traditions. The encounter between history and theology is indeed very important to us in this project, and yet not always easy to realize. This project started in fall 2022 as a collaboration between the Institute for Advanced Study Princeton and the Institute for Historical Theology at the University of Bern, with currently 11 postdoctoral scholars based at both locations and 13 academic collegium members spread around the globe. We meet regularly for online lectures and reading sessions, as well as for in-person conferences and workshops to explore together what we call the co-production of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. We are also running a website which contains case studies and sources of religious co-production, with the idea of creating a digital archive of religious co-production. Today, we will present 3 co-authored papers, the first one offering more general thoughts on what theology and history can offer each other when thinking together about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as co-produced religions, and the 2 other presenting case studies on what we might call specific moments of such religious co-production. To start with the first, religious co-production and its potentials for history and theology. Theology within a given religious tradition is often pursued with the idea of improving the tradition, or at least adapting it to present need. The critical constructive engagement with the past is then often aimed at unfolding the best a given tradition has to offer, or at purifying it of elements that the theologian considers not being part of the essence of their own religions. The guiding paradigm of historical thinking within a specific religious tradition is in many cases development, genealogy, purification, and improvement through continuous engagement with the past.
Now, modern historical research on religions generally questions such narratives of teleological development, pointing to the diverse and even contradictory nature of the many and varied forms of life and thought within a given religious tradition. Such research has primarily served as an invaluable form of critique vis-a-vis historically formulated claims for the justification of normative theological thinking. In recent decades, interest in interactions between Jews, Christians, and Muslims over the course of their entangled histories has provided yet another challenge to traditional narratives of development in which each tradition appears after some initial parting of the ways to flow through time independently of the others.
But the constructive potentials of historical research for theology have rarely been articulated or pursued by modern academic historians. Even more rarely does anyone, whether academic historian or theologian, ask what potentials the shared and competing history of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam can offer contemporary religious thought, not least at a time, modernity and postmodernity, when comprehensive conceptions of salvation history have become questionable within each religious tradition. There have certainly been numerous efforts toward interreligious understanding, but these often manifest a desire either to leave behind a past understood as conflict-laden or to uncover a less conflictual past that can be anointed as normative. Both approaches, however well-intentioned, seem to us profoundly ahistorical. We offer here a simultaneously critical and constructive view of what history and theology can mutually offer each other when thinking together about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as co-produced religions. By co-produced, we mean that these traditions, in all their sectarian variety, have always formed, reformed, and transformed themselves through interacting with, thinking about, and imagining each other, and continue to do so. This enduring codependence derives from two basic facts. The first is their shared reservoir and competing canon of prophetic claims, scriptures, and narratives. The second, more often forgotten, is that the historical as a mode of knowledge has itself proven fundamental to each of the three religions, not only at their origins, but in every moment of their existence.
Among the few modern academic historians to suggest that the proximity of history and theology could be a fruitful one was the Islamicist Marshall Hodgson, who spoke of the, quote, charismatic life-orientational traditions, those that call for ultimate commitment on the plane of the historical, end quote. By this, he meant that in these traditions, what happens in a particular moment, understood as historical, the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, the crucifixion of Jesus, or the conquest of Jerusalem, the Battle of the Ditch or of Karbala, but potentially also every action by an individual transforms the possibilities for the orientation of life in every future moment, and that every act or event or world image that is produced by or responds to such ultimate commitments will be irreversibly relevant in the ultimate future of the last judgment. So that's what he meant. Now, Hodgson held that it was the Israelites who had invented this sense of the historical, and that of these three religions in the Middle Ages, it was Islam that developed the strongest sense of the historical. We're skeptical of these specific views, nor do we find helpful the implicitly Christian vocabulary of kerygma, but we sympathize with his central claim that, quote, the study of history may turn out to be essential in helping us to work through in this dimension of our spiritual life to something more adequate than we have been able to discover so far, end quote. We would go further. One need not possess a spiritual life or consider oneself a believer to recognize that the study of the past of these three faiths, that is history, has potential to shape present and future thinking about God in these faiths, that is theology. At its simplest, our argument is that nolens volens, historical research creates constructive theological potentials as well as deconstructive critical ones, and that historians and theologians both should cultivate an awareness of those potentials. Indeed, among the things that such cultivation can teach us is that philosophies of history are not independent of theologies, a point we could illustrate through Hodgson himself. He insisted that one of the central attributes of these three religions was a sense of the, quote, irreversibility of one's acts, end quote. a position he understood as having conquered the world and which he seems to have taken as his own. We would rather understand his sense of the irreversibility of history as itself the product of teleological ideas that were co-produced among these three religions. And we would maintain instead that the relationship between the interpretation of the past and what can be thought in the present and future is better understood as an ever-present possibility of mutual transformation and as a relentlessly directional development. This is precisely why the historian and the theologian are so powerfully related and have so much to learn from each other. Every present transforms the past, keyword reinterpretation, and reinterpretation of the past transforms the possibilities of life in every present and future. Many revolutions in these phases presented themselves as a product of a better reading of divine teachings, theology, on historical or philological grounds. And each of these revolutions transformed the future possibilities for both theology and history.
Religious thinkers too, philosophers as well as theologians, have emphasized the constitutive importance of history for theological reflection in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Think, for example, of Wolfhard Pannenberg's theological program, Revelation as History, or of such different, even contradictory approaches to the past as those of Hermann Cohen and Franz Rosenzweig. It is precisely this constant reformation and reinterpretation of the past and the re-evaluation of previous claims to revelation that lead to contradictions within and between these three religious traditions. The many normative claims to represent the rediscovered true, original, or even purified meaning of revelation in the past not only foster religious diversity and differentiation, but also provoke conflicts within and between Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So for both historians and theologians in their respective claims to the past, this factual diversity within each and across all these communities provokes the normative question, what is Christianity? What is Islam? What is Judaism?
So here's an example. In his book, What is Islam?, the late Shahab Ahmed set out to demonstrate, quote, the prolific scale of contradiction between the ideas, values, and practices that claim normative affiliation with Islam, which poses a demanding problem of how to locate the coherence of an internally contradictory phenomenon, end quote. Problem posed, he sought to solve it not by dismissing one pole of a contradiction as either peripheral to Islam or as downright un-Islamic, but rather by formulating, quote, a conceptualization of Islam as a theoretical object that by identifying the coherent dynamic of eternal contradiction enables us to comprehend the integrity and identity of the historical and human phenomenon at play, end quote. So Ahmad's Islam cannot be located in any specific normative content, not law, not the 5 pillars, not even the Islamic, not even the Shahada. And yet he also insists that, quote, out there in the world beyond the individual Muslim is something that this Muslim recognizes as Islam, and that the two, end quote, and that the two, individual Muslim and Islam out there, are co-constitutive. That was his word, co-constitutive. Where then, if not in normative content, does this Islam reside? Ahmad's answer turns out to be profoundly historical. Islam is the sum of everything that has ever been lived or experienced as Islamic. It's this hugely diverse aggregate of all previous Islamic experiences. It's through this vast archive of Islam past that every possible Islamic engagement with revelation gains meaning in every moment in time, every present and every future. What we call archive, Ahmad called the context within which the meaning of any possible Islam is produced. Quote, that whole field or complex or vocabulary of meanings of revelation that have been produced in the course of human and historical hermeneutical engagement with revelation and which are thus already present as Islam, end quote, in any given moment.
That's Far Ahmed. We would add that the same is also true for Christianity and Judaism. They too are the sum of everything that has ever been lived or thought or claimed to be Jewish or Christian. what Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are, is defined by what any Christian, Jews, and Muslims have at any point claimed to be or experienced as Muslim, Jewish, or Christian. That might already strike some as a radical claim. And yet we are suggesting something even more radical. The history of these three faiths is a conjoined one, insofar as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have since their beginnings distinguished and approximated themselves from and to each other by making rival claims to what they understand to be a common prophetic origin and historical past. Across the time, they have sometimes interacted with and more often imagined each other, while continuing to produce and transform themselves by thinking about their claims to the past. The entirety of that dynamic and ongoing process we call co-production, and it too, co-production too, constitutes an archive, one that has not only made historical hermeneutics a potent instrument of sectarian formation for communities within a given tradition, but also a powerful tool in polemic and apologetics across them.
So if within Islam or Judaism or Christianity, the archive of historical commitments constitutes an inexhaustible archive of possibilities that gives these religions the capacity for constant transformation of both past and present, the same is true across them. The archive of all past historical commitments and imaginings through which these traditions in all their variety have co-produced each other, the vast majority of which have undoubtedly vanished without trace. That archive constitutes an ocean to be explored not only by the historian who seeks to understand how Muslims, Christians, and Jews have thought about or experienced each other in the past, but also by the theologian co-producing Islam, Christianity, and Judaism in the present and the future.
Focusing on that second possibility, we want to ask, can historical theology take place within the combined archive of the three traditions? What impact could the exploration of the co-produced histories and hermeneutics have on theology within Islam, Christianity, and Judaism? At the very least, awareness of the historical co-production of these faiths should challenge segregated approaches to their histories and their hermeneutics, and suggest that within these three traditions, theological thinking pursued without an awareness of the other two is partial and impoverished. If it is true that Jews, Christians, and Muslims could scarcely think about God and revelation without also thinking about each other in the past, then this means that even in the present and the future, theology can scarcely be produced within one of these traditions without an imagining of the others. We should want to cultivate an awareness of that imagining. In other words, to think historically within the three religions implies attention not only to the development of one's own tradition, but also to the permanent entanglement of the three. Within each of the religious traditions, theologians make use nolens volens of the shared historical and hermeneutic archive in their thinking about God, the relationship of humans to God, the nature and meaning of revelation and of the historical. We would go so far as to say that Jews, Muslims, and Christians cannot understand their own religious tradition without taking into account how it has been shaped by the other two, real or imagined, in the manifold moments of their co-produced history. The many competing and often polemical adaptations and appropriations within and across Judaism, Islam, and Christianity can only be understood as such if we become aware of what has been incorporated and transformed into our own religious tradition, and vice versa. What has been adopted and transformed by others may also have provoked repercussions in one's own tradition. One example. Christian salvation history was very much shaped by the idea that the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans was a divine punishment for the rejection of Jesus as the Messiah. Since late antiquity, Christian authors used the Bellum Judaicum of the Jewish historian Josephus to prove their supersessionist claims with that historical event. In the 10th century, a Jewish author in southern Italy produced the Sefer Josephon, a rewritten translation of the Christianized Josephus, in order to regain the Jewish historian for a Jewish historical narrative of God's story with his people. This work found its way to Muslim and then also Christian communities in Northern Africa, in Judeo-Arabic, Coptic, and Ethiopic languages, providing possibilities for interpretation of world history for each of those communities. In modern times, an English translation of the Sefer Yosepon was the first book ever printed in the United States of America, and it remains a bestseller in Israel. So in appropriating, expropriating, and reappropriating this Josephine narrative, all three traditions have used the historical event of the destruction of the temple for their own theological interpretation of religious history, and in doing so, have repeatedly produced new opportunities for appropriation, expropriation, and reappropriation by the other two. These dynamics are present when Jews, Muslims, or Christians think about the theological significance of the Jerusalem temple today, regardless of whether or not they know the interwoven history of Josephus' work. In this sense, exploring religious co-production serves the formation, reformation, transformation of one's own religious thinking and identity. If Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are understood as co-produced at their core, and if co-production is a never-ending dynamic in their shared history, then every moment of the past has the potential to be put to theological work within the three religions, whether in the name of peace and love, or of conflict and violence. Gratitude and guilt are both proximate potentials within this shared archive, and difficult, perhaps impossible for the historian or the theologian to separate from one another.
This point is important. Enlarging the archives of interreligious history does not reduce the possibilities for conflict or contempt within and between the traditions. It may even expand them. Because adherents of the three religions in all their competing variety have often used the historical for polemical and apologetic purposes, these archives contain countless instances of opposition, supersessionism, separation, even extermination, many more perhaps than moments of appreciation, recognition, toleration, or merely indifference. But again, this historical co-production is not irreversible. The relationship between the interpretation of the past and possibilities for thought in the present and future contains the possibility that the present might transform the past, reinterpretation, and that the reinterpretation of the past might transform the possibilities of life in the future. If that seems too strong, consider that within these historical faiths, every believer has been and is called upon to commit, at least tacitly, to some sense of how the historical, the lived present, and the eternal relate to each other. Those commitments have vastly varied, not only over time, space, and sect, but even within one individual. Even the faith of a saint is built upon sands of time and fissures of psyche. The sum of all these past commitments, the vast majority of which, to repeat, have undoubtedly vanished without trace, constitutes an archive of possibilities not only for historians of religion, but for all who seek to relate time and the historical to the divine and the eternal. Hence, we insist that historical religions contain within themselves, precisely insofar as they are historical, the capacity for constant transformation of both past and present. Within these religions, norms are created in the name of the historical and challenged, even shattered, in the same name. In other words, when as historians we discover new meanings in the past, we may simultaneously be offering a powerful resource, and the echo with ressourcement is deliberate, to future theologians.
This understanding of historical momentum as a coincident of the historical, the present, and the eternal resonates with certain theological thinking about revelation. Thinkers in all three religions have formulated the idea that God's eternity cannot be grasped in a single moment of revelation in time, nor as a developing line that stretches from the past over the present to the future, but that eternity must be understood as the fullness of time. According to Franz Rosenzweig, this was what Judaism and Christianity shared in their understanding of revelation. Quote, "Revelation is in the present, and indeed it is the present par excellence. It looks back to the past in the moment where it would like to give its present actuality the former statement, but it sees this past only by shining into it the light of the present. It is only in this backward glance that the past reveals itself to be the foundation and portent of the presently lived experience housed in the I." End quote. Strikingly, Rosenzweig used Islam, or rather his imagination of Islam, as a negative mirror to form this idea of Judaism and Christianity as historical religions. I quote him again, "Mohammed found and took over the idea of revelation as one picks up something found. That is to say, without producing it from out of its presuppositions. The Quran," it's always Rosenzweig, "the Quran is a Talmud that is not based on a scripture. It is a New Testament without the Old. Islam has only revelation and not prophecy." So far Rosenzweig. Islam is thus separated from Judaism and Christianity as lacking the sense of the theological potential of history. Our discussion of Hodgson and Ahmed should make clear that we do not agree with this presentation of Islam. In fact, we see Rosenzweig's treatment of Islam as yet another co-production, indeed as an example of a strategy of co-production utilized in all three traditions that we call the excluded third, in which similarities between two traditions are stressed in order to define themselves against the third. We've suggested that the existential significance of every specific moment in time, the potential coincidence of the historical and the eternal in every given present, is central to the understanding of revelation in the mainstream of all three religions. From this, we would also derive the answer to the question of what theology can offer history. It is the awareness that for the Jewish, Muslim, and Christian believers whose actions and thoughts historians seek to explore, each moment in time, as profane and contingent as it may seem from afar, was and is pregnant with potential theological significance in the co-production of the historical, the present, and the eternal. From this, we derive specific responsibilities for both historians and theologians. Historians of religion, regardless of whether they understand themselves as believers, have the responsibility to recognize this emic awareness of the interdependence of past, present, and eternal, thereby not only discovering new potentials for theology, but also more adequately understanding the objects of their interest. Theologians, in turn, have the responsibility to perceive the contextual circumstances and specific possibilities of each realization of revelation in a given moment in time.
Historians can continue to teach theologians that no idea about God developed by necessity, but at best with a particular plausibility that can be explained by contemporary circumstances, power relations, restrictions or extensions of knowledge, etc., while also realizing and emphasizing the constructive potentials of that contingency. As historians, theologians, believers, or students of the past, we can draw on this co-produced archive to discover or promote positive or peace-promoting potentials of these religious traditions and put them to constructive theological work in the present. But we will also discover destructive potentials in the archive and in every one of the traditions. We don't get to say, if we want to be historical, that one is true to the archive and another is not. But it is our decision, and indeed our responsibility as historians and theologians, to decide which of these ambivalent potentials, co-produced in an infinite, or at least uncountable number of moments in the past, we activate today in historical and theological writing, teaching, preaching, and pastoral care. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Heyden and Dr. Nirenberg. We're going to move on to our first historical case studies. Maureen, Attali, and Jillian Stinchcomb, I believe, are first. So let me do this.
Should I share the screen?
Yes. Let me
Okay.
also.
Yeah. And yeah. Is everyone able to see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. I'll go on then. So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here for our presentation. So this paper developed out of a seminar and a conference which were organized by David and Katharina on hypocrisy. Because hypocrisy is an accusation so often leveled in religious polemic, the Interactive Histories co-produced communities group explored whether and how we might consider the concept of hypocrisy to be co-produced. Jill and I were interested in hypocrisy in early Jewish texts, especially between the Hebrew Bible and Toledot Yeshu, which is a late antique Jewish polemic text. And this is the result of our research. So let's begin with semantics a little bit. So hypocrite, in Greek hypokrites, is a substantive which originally pertained to interpretation or acting performance. The corresponding verb is hypokrinomai, which means to answer, to explain, or to play a part. It is a compound verb, you can hear it, with the prefix hypo associated with the verb krino. Krino means to distinguish, to choose, or to decide. So as you can hear, none of those words had any religious or moral connotation to begin with. Those connotations only came to be when those words were picked up by some of the Jews who translated the Bible into Greek somewhere around 200 BCE.
Excellent. And so while the Hebrew Bible does denounce what we would definitely define as religious hypocrisy, meaning, put simply, a contradiction between act and speech, we're all very familiar with the language of lips and heart in Hebrew Bible, the Jewish translators did not use the word hypocrites or hypokrinomai, anything similar to that when translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek. The concept of hypocrisy is really visible in the Hebrew Bible, as we can see in quotes like the one on the screen. But the term or its semantic equivalent is actually absent from biblical Hebrew and also actually in later rabbinic texts as well. However, the word hypocrites and hypokrinomai and derivatives thereof were sometimes used by Jews who translated the Hebrew Bible and other Hebrew texts into Greek to describe behavior that a wise or an ethical person would avoid. It's paired with terms like impiety and lawlessness, usually in wisdom texts. You can see on the screen, Job, Wisdom of Ben Sira, etc. And so it really seems like the Septuagint imbues this Greek term with an ethical valence within intra-Jewish discourse in particular. A shift comes about when we start looking at Jewish apocryphal texts, Greek apocryphal texts, which use a sort of, sometimes the more non-religious sense. There's a quote in 2nd Maccabees about Apollonius being a hypocrite, pretending to be peaceful when he's not. But it also develops this association with religious identity, because it's used to criticize an inadequate relationship between a Jew and a God, where a Jewish person doesn't fear God properly. And particularly in 2nd Maccabees, either Jason of Cyrene or his abbreviator, and the author of 4th Maccabees, complexified the religious meaning of the word by associating its definition with pretending to act contrary to one's religious identity. So in this case, it's about Eleazar pretending to not be a devout Jew by pretending to eat sacrificial meat, and he refuses that hypocrisy. So hypocrisy there is thus defined as seemingly acting pagan while being Jewish, but the accusation is framed within an intra-Jewish debate specifically.
So based on early Christian writings, some prominent Christian theologians of the 4th and 5th centuries built on the definition of hypocrisy that Jillian just explained that emerged from 2 and 4 Maccabees. However, what they did is that they appropriated it by replacing Judaism with Christianity. For instance, when delivering a homily about the so-called Maccabean martyrs, the 4th century Bishop of Constantinople, John Chrysostom, argued that those martyrs were Christians and that their deaths actually proved the hypocrisy of the Jews. So you can see it on the slide. He's talking about those martyrs that died in 2 and 4 Maccabees, and he said, they received their wounds for Christ's sake. This I will not attempt to demonstrate. Tell me, for what reason did they suffer? Because of the law, you say, and the edicts that lie within the law. If then it is apparent that it was Christ who gave that law, they displayed all of that boldness for the lawgiver. Come then, let us demonstrate this today, that it is Christ who gave the law. I ask the Jew, I ask the sick brother and sister, I mean Christians who do not believe they should venerate the Maccabean martyr, who gave the new covenant? Without a doubt, everyone will say Christ. Therefore, he also gave the old. So John's underlying argument here is that Jews actually know that Jesus is the Messiah, but refuse to act on this knowledge. In other words, they are Jewish while being actually Christians. The physical suffering of the Maccabean martyrs is interpreted as a proof not of the martyrs' Jewishness, but on the contrary, of their Christian identity. That is to say, the proof of a contradiction between act and belief. And here we think, for the first time, hypocrisy becomes first a truly interreligious accusation, but also a definition of the religious other, who is the other, is the hypocrite. The hypocrisy as a definition of the religious other was also taken up by Jews during late antiquity. This is the real co-production in our example. Jewish discourses on Jesus, as reported by early Christian writings, claim that Jesus knew he wasn't the Messiah and purposefully deceived people by answering them he would heal their physical suffering. Those discourses were attributed to Jews in Christian texts, which revert the accusation of hypocrisy by defining the Jews as the hypocritical ones. Late antique Jewish anti-Christian polemics paint Jesus as the arch-hypocrite, without using the word, which, as Jillian said, does not have any equivalent in Hebrew or Aramaic. In this extract from the earliest version of Toledot Yeshu, which was written in the early 5th century, it is a parodic retelling of the Gospels. In it, Jesus knew that his body would be taken off the cross, and he used that knowledge to mislead his followers and falsely convince them that he would be resurrected. However, in this parody, the Jewish heroes of the story saw through his scheming, and they revealed his deception. Jesus' body was then displayed, and its deterioration interpreted as proof of his hypocrisy. So Jewish parodies of Jesus' crucifixion, there are a few other, there are not very many, but there are a few, mocks his claims at messiahship by dwelling on his physical suffering. And here, the text explicitly presents hypocrisy as an intra-Jewish accusation, like in 2 Maccabees, Jesus is framed as a bad Jew, like he was in Talmudic literature. But the text is also very visibly aware that hypocrisy was understood as an interreligious accusation at the time, with Jesus' followers saying the Jews deal in lies.
So to conclude, the intra-Jewish Hellenistic definition of religious hypocrisy was reframed by Christian theologians who leveled it against Jews sort of writ large. And the Jewish definition of hypocrisy and its relationship with physical suffering came to be inflected by its Christian appropriation. Physical suffering, defined as proof of sincerity in intra-Jewish discourses during the Hellenistic period, was redefined as the proof of hypocrisy in late antique interreligious polemics against Christianity. And so we found this to be interesting, an interesting case study in thinking about how a single concept and the term, which have related but somewhat distinct histories, came to be turned and reformulated in processes of religious co-production. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the both of you for an excellent presentation here. We will move on to our next historical case study. Let me see here. Oh, yeah. It's Shlomo Zuckier and David Gyllenhaal. So please go ahead.
Okay, fantastic. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to ask for a quick thumbs up from everybody if everything is coming through okay. Okay, thank you. So first of all, thanks so much to Axel and to the conveners for the invitation. And I'm also going to beg your patience in advance, all of you, as Shlomo and I are going to take you way into the weeds of something, but we promise it'll be worth it by the time we get to the end. So today, Shlomo and I would like to present you with a very brief, very granular, but we think very illuminating case study of religious co-production, hidden within two mysterious verses of the Quran and its later exegesis. Now, the more extensive version of this case study is set to appear in a forthcoming issue of Dar Islam, but we're going to sort of take you on a very brief tour through the details of the argument. David and Katharina's paper spoke very eloquently of co-production as a process by which Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have, quote, interacted with and imagined each other while continuing to produce and transform themselves by thinking about their claims to the past. And ours is a case in which Islam's sacred scripture and its earliest exegetes appear to be both interacting with and imagining the Jewish tradition and the Jewish past, albeit to polemical ends. We should begin then with the two verses themselves, ayah 58 and 59 of Surah al-Baqarah, which recount a very mysterious episode in the history of the Israelites. Here's the first, quote, and when we said, enter this township and eat easefully of it wherever you will, and enter in at the gate prostrating and say, unburdening, or in Arabic, hitta, we will forgive you your transgressions and increase the good doers. It's followed. Then the evildoers substituted a saying other than that which had been said to them. So we sent down upon the evildoers wrath out of heaven for their ungodliness. Now, two questions about these verses present themselves immediately. First, what is the real meaning of hitta, the word which God commands the Israelites to say? Now, in Arabic, this would seem to be a verbal noun that means unburdening. It's a word you might use for a donkey settling down. But that doesn't actually make a lot of sense in context. And then there's another question. What is the saying with which the Israelites replaced the word that they were ordered to say? The entire passage doesn't quite make sense without an answer to these two questions. And the natural place to look for answers is in the Arab Islamic tradition of Quranic exegesis, or tafsir. So let's begin by posing our questions to the great 10th century exegete At-Tabari. First, what does hitta actually mean in this context? At-Tabari tells us that nobody actually knows. Quote, the exegetes are at variance about the exegesis of hitta. He cites many different traditions, but they are all wildly contradictory and don't seem to lead anywhere in particular. Now, second, what word did the Israelites replace it with? At-Tabari's testimony gets even more confusing on this point. He cites 14 different traditions about the word with which the Israelites replaced hitta, and nearly all of them involve a confusing Arabic pun on hitta with words for grain, either with hinta, a word for wheat, or with hibba, a word for an individual grain of wheat. So, to summarize, we still don't know what hitta really means in these verses, and we still don't know what word the Israelites were punished for putting in its place. Instead, we have stumbled into two further puzzles presented by the classical exegetical tradition itself. First, God seems to demand a speech act from the Israelites. The context of the passage makes it clear that by pronouncing this particular word, their sins are supposed to be resolved. And yet, the Arabic word hitta does not seem to be able to serve as a speech act. And second, the exegetical tradition is convinced that the unspecified word which the Israelites substituted for hitta is a pun on a word for grain. But why? So for these questions, we have to go one step back. We have to go to the pre-classical 8th century exegete Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, who died in 767 CE. And here is his key passage on these verses. Quote, now when they entered the gate, those who do good said what they were ordered, but others said hitta sikmatha, meaning red wheat. They said this as a ridicule and a substitution in place of what they had been ordered. So God annihilated from among them 70,000 on one day as a punishment for their saying hitta sikmatha. So this saying was their wrongdoing. By glossing it with an Arabic translation, Muqatil is making clear that hitta sikmatha, the wicked replacement for the word hitta, is not Arabic. And perhaps this points us towards a solution for the second question, which emerged from our look at the tafsir. Maybe the grain-related pun, which later exegetes continued to repeat, but clearly struggled to understand, makes better sense in a non-Arabic language. In fact, if we follow that suspicion, we find Muqatil pointing us towards a solution to the first question we had for the classical works of tafsir as well. How can we derive a speech act from the recitation of hitta? Muqatil is pointing us towards a grain-related pun in a non-Arabic language by which the Israelites evaded what God had really demanded them, namely a formal confession of guilt.
When we look at Muqatil's full exegesis of verses 58 and 59 of Surat al-Baqarah, we see him alluding to a variety of passages in the Hebrew Bible. Muqatil links his exegesis of this passage with the character of Joshua and the city of Jericho, which the Israelites entered after Moses had died and they crossed into the land. In the biblical account, immediately following the capture of Jericho, one person named Achan takes the prohibited spoils from that city. The Lord tells Joshua that Israel has sinned. Achan is identified and confesses to God, saying, I have sinned, Anochi Chatati, to the Lord God of Israel, and he is stoned and burned to death. Another biblical text that Muqatil alludes to is Numbers chapter 14, which follows the negative report from the spies, the people's sinful rebellion, and God's declaration that this generation will not enter the promised land. In response, the group asserts, here we are, and we shall ascend to the place that the Lord says, for we have sinned, hi chatanu. Moses tells them not to do so because it defies the Lord. They ascend nevertheless and are killed. Muqatil's account specifies that the Quran's divine punishment for saying the wrong thing annihilated from among them 70,000 on one day. This particular detail is strikingly similar to what appears at 2 Samuel 24, where David, after imposing an improper census, is punished by a plague on Israel from the morning until the fixed time, in which 70,000 men die. Muqatil seems to understand that the recitation of the term hitta is meant to yield forgiveness. It's a speech act yielding atonement. This mechanism of confession, a concept with deep biblical roots, generally involves stating the root chata, to sin, in first person. Applied to the Quranic passage, the Israelites are asked to confess, fail to follow those instructions by saying something else instead of hitta, and they are punished with death. On this interpretation, the word hitta, as presented by the Quran and Muqatil, should be understood as a transliteration of a Hebrew or possibly Aramaic word, either chatanu or chatain, we have sinned. What's more, in each of the three biblical passages alluded to, a person or a group is expected to confess for a sin that they committed, they fail to do so or do so unsuccessfully, and finally are killed as a result. This is precisely the fact pattern in this Quran passage as told by Muqatil. The Israelites sin, seem to confess, and are killed nonetheless because they never actually said the word for confession. So we have solved puzzle number one. How is hitta a relevant speech act? It's a prescribed confession based on the Hebrew or Aramaic words for sin, also used in confessions. Turning to puzzle number two, what is the pun about grain? Muqatil asserts that instead of the people saying hitta as a confession for their sins, they swapped in the words hitta sikmata, a foreign word meaning red wheat. Indeed, the term hitta sikmata is a perfectly intelligible transliteration of an Aramaic or perhaps Hebrew phrase meaning red wheat. Muqatil points toward a scenario in which the Israelites presented themselves as if they were confessing by appearing to state hitta, sin, or we have sinned, while they were actually saying hitta, or wheat. Notably, the punning of wheat and sin appears in a Jewish text produced not long before the Quran, as the Babylonian Talmud offers a pun between a grain of wheat, chita, and sin, chatat, at Brachot 61a. So this pun is not new, but has been grist for the mill of Semitic language religious interpretation for generations.
So with this revelation, we can now turn back to the two questions that we posed at the very beginning. First, oh, sorry, one second. The two questions that we had were, number one, what is the meaning of Hitta? And now we know it is an Aramaic or Hebrew word for sin, betokening God's demand that the Israelites should confess. Second, what is the word with which the Israelites replaced it? It is an Aramaic or Hebrew word for wheat, which can be punned on a word for sin in those languages, and which allowed the Israelites to evade God's demand for confession. The theory of a sinful Aramaic or Hebrew pun on the words for sin and grain provides a very satisfying answer to both questions. God asked the Israelites to confess their sin, but they disobeyed by way of a punning substitution, subtly twisting the word for sin into the nearly homophonous word for grain.
The pun, just like the punishment, can be clarified by recourse to Christian or more likely Jewish tradition, as the punning of sin and wheat appears in the Talmud in Hebrew and likely resembles Mukatel's wordplay. We can never know for sure if this sinful pun lies behind the Quranic passage itself, but it does represent an extremely compelling solution, and one which could only have come about from beyond the Islamic tradition. From the granular and grammatical analysis of red wheat to the accounts of puns and punishments across Jewish and Islamic tradition, only the Jews can help Mukatel explain why the Israelites sinned. Thank you.
Very much, David and Shlomo. So we now have had a keynote, and then two historical case studies, perhaps two of the infinite or maybe just uncountable number of co-produced contexts, right, given to us from an historical perspective. And so now we're very glad to welcome, we have 6 presenters, Jewish, Muslim and Christian theologians, scholar practitioners, responding from their own perspective about this presentation as theologians, or writing, if you will, as scholar practitioners. We begin with Adam Gregerman, and I'll transition after each one. So please, Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, so hi there, and thanks for the chance to join the discussion. My short comments today are on a possible limitations, tensions of the idea of co-produced religion when used as a method of analysis by insiders and outsiders to a religious tradition. And by outsiders, I mean here non-co-religionists. And I want to use terminology, and it's can be a little complex here, but I think it's helpful to use a terminology that was used by the keynoters for describing two perspectives. One, the scholarly perspective, the so-called etic perspective, and the other, the emic perspective of the insider or the believer. Now, the keynoters pay attention to the responsibility of noting not just the etic perspective, but also paying attention to the emic perspective, that is the insider, the one who is the believer. And this makes sense, right? So on the one hand, the etic perspective is in some ways primarily the one we're relying upon. It's the one that historians of religion use when talking about historical religions. If I could also quote the keynoters as well for this idea of an etic perspective, they say, quote, that religions have shared, quote, shared reservoir of claims. They have a shared reservoir of claims, scriptures, and narratives. And I want to highlight this word here, shared, referring to some type of influence between traditions or overlap between the development of these traditions. Now, that's fairly straightforward. However, when we turn to the topic of the emic perspective, I want to see if I can sort of problematize that in light of our use of this idea of co-produced religion. Because to insiders, that is to believers, there's something challenging, I think, or possibly even unacceptable about recognizing the existence of a co-produced religion, right? Historically, certainly many pre-modern religions, and probably most believers today, have an emic perspective. That is, their perspective may be exclusively limited to what it is they see from within their tradition looking out. Now, the richness of the etic perspective is that it gives us a sort of outsider view of a tradition in its broader context. On the other hand, it seems to me to be a largely inaccessible perspective to those with the emic perspective, right? The status of the non-co-religionist to the insider in a religious tradition is very complex, right? It's ambiguous what you think of the non-co-religionist. Co-religionists are shunned, potentially hated. And so, by this idea of co-production, it sort of challenges me to think about how you do that from within a tradition, from the emic tradition. Now, is co-production therefore exclusively an etic tradition, right? It's hard to see that influence from within a tradition. And I'd even go so far as to say there's not really an inherent motive for a believer, for one on the inside, to recognize co-production. To go back to the phrase that the keynoters use of a shared reservoir of competing claims, I thought to myself, do believers, insiders, want to share any claims at all? It seems to me that people are sort of inclined from within a tradition not to be especially interested in sharing their claims or seeing that they're shared by others. If anything, that's a threat to the barriers that groups set up. It may even introduce doubt or unacceptable questions. Even when believers recognize that they share beliefs, practices, etc., few of them go so far as to legitimize those shared beliefs, practices with the non-co-religionist, right? I'll use the example of Christians, right? Christians from the inside wouldn't simply say, oh, we share things with Jews, any more than you could imagine a Muslim saying, oh, yeah, we share things with Jews and Christians, right? It's a much more complicated perspective for the insider to use a concept like sharing. And I wonder if that limits the usefulness of co-production. Let me just say briefly about the topic related to this of polemic. Polemic is very much an emic perspective, right? We use polemic, people inside a tradition use polemic to serve the religious goals of the group, right? They raise boundaries, they establish truth versus falsehood, and they're often zero-sum. Now that's the emic perspective. For the outsider, say the historian who has an etic perspective, polemic can be seen from a sort of disinterested point of view, and in some ways says, we know what the insider is doing perhaps better than they do. That is, we see how it is functioning for them. We might even go so far as to say, look what it is that they share with the group with whom they're polemicizing against whom they're polemicizing. Insiders don't really have much of a motive to see it in those terms, and therefore I wonder if these are, if not opposed, even mutually exclusive perspectives. If we're going to talk finally about peace-promoting proposals, which I very much appreciated at the end of the talk, I wonder what sort of challenge it is for us to use co-production as a method for getting there. I want to highlight some of the tensions between those proposals and ask about the challenge of moving between insider and outside status. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Adam. We're going to move next to Rachel Sutsky.
So much. Excuse me. First, I'd like to thank Axel for inviting me to participate. And I think the work everyone is doing here to be terribly valuable and thought-provoking and urgent, especially as both a scholar working at the intersection of ancient Judaism and early Christianity, and as a Jew who lives as a practitioner and a scholar simultaneously. The keynote from David Nirenberg and Katharina Heyden today mentions the powerful potential in this theologian-historian relationship. One of the questions provided for us as respondents to consider was, what role is there for maintaining boundaries of tradition, including practices and beliefs? One role or means for doing this, which I'm neither endorsing nor rejecting, is to simply ignore the historical. Indeed, in the Jewish tradition, there has developed a traditional understanding that does just this. For example, regarding holy texts. So the conception that the Torah was given in one fell swoop to Moses at Sinai. This reflects an impulse to dehistoricize, to move away from any process-oriented thinking, developmental or incremental coming together of texts, anything bound by human limitations or human creations. And once you can reject human elements of one text, you can start to reject human elements of others. For example, the notion of the oral Torah, the Talmud. So suddenly you have religious thinkers like the rabbis of old who are considered neither inventive nor creative, because those, contrary to contemporary values, are qualities seen as undermining the divinity and therefore the authority of those early texts. So one could say that an option is to say historians or scholars have nothing to add except for curious findings, interesting parallels to corroborate things with the larger world, but that any findings they would have that could contradict or cast doubt on a unified and divine text have to be considered as dismissed. I think one way to answer this question as well is to think about the boundaries the historian or the scholar has as well in the most rigid iteration. The historian is not expected to lend credence to claims of prophecy or revelation or miracles. There is a deeply rational empirical trend in modern scholarship, which has not always been there, but is surely the case today. So I think the question of boundaries can be eased, if not erased, by thinking about the category of lived religion, that the historian needn't ever claim something to be true in order to simply describe others who think it to be true. The historian, without sensitivity to traditional beliefs and ways of understanding, really actually loses out on, I think, their full scholarly responsibility. They fail to educate about the way that practitioners practice, the way that practitioners believe. As a scholar working in a deeply confessional Catholic institution, I find myself trying to combine these approaches. I watch my Catholic students, primarily teaching priests and nuns, as they negotiate issues of history with theological convictions. A pedagogical tool I try to employ is to look at texts on multiple layers. So if we study Isaiah and we attend to the text about a young woman who will give birth, I try to go layer by layer to explore how we can perform exegesis and make sense of this text. We might look at it from a Hebrew or originally Jewish notion that it's prophecy unrelated to Jesus, unrelated to virginity. We might look at the Septuagint's translational ambiguities, which could allow for one to believe this text predicts a virgin birth. And then we can look at the Gospel's reliance on this text as prophetic authority substantiating the virgin birth of Jesus. And the demand I make of my students is not belief or acceptance, but deep consideration of ideas. And so to this question of maintaining boundaries, I think all three religious traditions need to and do wrestle not only with one another, but with this influence of the academic, this force that constantly seeks to question and challenge with empirical observation, rational thought, as alternatives to claims of revelation and divine intervention. And those can be mutually illuminating. We were also asked to respond to the question, how might theological questions change? Or how might we imagine religious borders today differently? I don't fully know, but I think what was modeled in a paper like Shlomo and David's is that consulting with those outside of your religion might be essential to understanding your religion. A personal example of this from my college days was in studying the biblical hermeneutics of the medieval scholar Maimonides, where I realized how much I needed a better background in usul al-fiqh, the Islamic jurisprudence of the time, to better understand a fellow Jewish thinker. So one way to reimagine these borders is to believe it's a necessity for your own religious elucidation to encounter the other. Another way to answer this question of borders and theological questions is that I think religious people and scholars or historians need to think about how one group's theological questions might be applied to and adapted to another faith group. For example, I taught a course in which we discussed the presence of demons throughout the Gospels. And demonology is a curiosity to me, but it had never been a deep part of my scholarly or personal religious introspection. Teaching this class, I was taken aback by the many enthusiastic testimonials of my students, many of them Catholic religious from Africa, who believe in demons powerfully and had an emotional reaction to testify to these experiences, which really gave them a continuity back to Jesus and his exorcising demons. It was a deeply held conviction. This impacted me in two ways. One was that I needed to make room moving forward for the personal and the theological, even in the scholarly setting of a classroom. And also that perhaps I had come up short in not interrogating my own neutrality about the concept of demons. And how do I feel about that topic in terms of my scholarship and in terms of my religiosity? Finally, we were asked what it means to think within a tradition with its boundaries and convictions while we acknowledge the co-production of these religions. I think a lot about the Harold Bloom's phrase of the anxiety of influence, with desire to find one's religion exceptional, while also taking into account what is totally shared and co-produced, which we could say might make the exceptional into the mundane. This is an ongoing tension. I think we need to hold both the idea of exceptionalism and singularity about our own religions while also understanding co-production as a factual, ubiquitous, and helpful phenomenon. I think the closest we might get to this, and I just want to close with this, is a poem that I love by Yehuda Amichai. It's called Shir Ein Sofi, a poem without an end. And it's very, very short. This is how it goes. Inside the brand new museum, there's an old synagogue. Inside the synagogue is me. Inside me is my heart. Inside my heart, a museum. Inside the museum, a synagogue. Inside it, me. Inside me, my heart. Inside my heart, a museum. I don't know if Amichai had in mind what I have in mind reading this, but I read it as this poem about having ongoing and unending, you could say eternal, a term that's very relevant to these co-produced religions, eternal layers within us. We have the new, pristine, scholarly museum, which is analytical and cutting edge and attractive and looks at things from a distance and presents them in a certain way and curates things to a general public of practitioners and non-practitioners. And we also have the old synagogue, this place of tradition that never thought it needed a museum. And there's this spiral that we find ourselves in of our own hearts and our own minds as scholars and practitioners that I think are somehow able to simultaneously hold space for both the synagogue and the museum, the practitioner or theologian and the historian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. It was a pleasure to have both you and Adam with us today. We're going to move on to Lady Tulfitria, who is joining us as well. Please go ahead.
Thank you for the invitation to the conference of this program. Hello all from Singapore. It's 1 a.m. here, so let me just start my stopwatch so that I'm on time. And here is my response. So as many decolonial theories argues, one of the biggest myths out there is the universalization of specific forms of knowledge in which this knowledge is imbued with the authority to speak about and for all. To some extent, this universalization and singularization of knowledge has also happened within and across religious traditions. One of the potential contributions of co-produced religions, as articulated by Heyden and Nirenberg, is to show the intricate relationships that the three religions have historically, and that it is impossible to understand the theology of one without paying full attention to the historical relationships between each of the traditions. Expanding this potential to see the formation of religious authority in Islam that, as Hiba Abu Gideiri said, is dominated by its androcentric nature, we can see that patriarchal Islamic authority is also a form of knowing that has been mythologized as a universal way of knowing and talking about Islam. Many marginalized Muslim voices, women, queer, low socioeconomic class Muslims, non-Arabs, etc., have been excluded from the archive of Islamic sacred knowledge in the past, and that has consequences on the religious tradition that has formed today. This leads to the absence of marginalized voices from the Islamic sacred history and to the hegemonic perception that is associated with androcentric Islamic knowledge as the original form of Islamic teachings, i.e., as the only holder of Islamic authority from the past to the present. As with the hegemonic form of Islamic knowledge that doesn't acknowledge the influence and contribution of the non-Muslim or Islamic others to the formation of Islamic history, the androcentric Islamic knowledge does not admit the presence and roles of marginalized Muslim others who have also contributed to the formation of Islamic sacred history. To use the lens of co-produced religions within Islam means to expose the silenced marginalized Muslim voices that so far has been relegated to the periphery of Islamic sacred history. Though they don't use the lens of co-produced religions, the highlighting of marginalized voices in Islamic history has been spearheaded by many Muslim feminist scholars such as Kecia Ali, Zahra Ayubi, and Asma Afsaruddin. In short, the potential of co-produced religions is not limited to highlighting the importance of the religious others in one's religious history, but also with a twist, it can be used to call attention to the silencing of marginalized voices within a religion's history and maybe also the present. Co-produced religions as a lens shows us that there is no siloed, singular religion that can be totally divorced from the other. It shows us that the formation of a body of knowledge and its history has always been in relation to its supposed others, and thus cannot be understood without accounting for the roles and places of that others in the construction of knowledge and history. That's the first point. The second point is that as a person whose work straddles anthropology and theology and who is concerned more about the contemporary rather than the historical, I can see co-produced religions everywhere I look. This is significantly different from absolutist and exclusivist claims made by many religious leaders, for believers at the grassroots level understand that they cannot live without one another. From my research on interreligious reconciliation on the Ambon Island in Indonesia, to my current research on the interreligious lives of migrant domestic workers in Singapore, I have seen various forms of interreligious friendships blossom, not from any religious or theological factors, but rather from the dynamics of daily lives, from the anthropological and sociological elements of human lives. Heyden and Nirenberg have dealt with the difference between the historical and the theological and how they fit into each other within the framework of co-produced religions. However, I'm not yet sure about how co-produced religions can be used as a lens to understand the complexity of interreligious lives in the present day. With history, you have an archive from which you can access factual data on interreligious relations in the past. But this archive is also not free of bias because knowledge production in the past was dominated by the most powerful elements of the society. The historical archive only recorded the thoughts of the powerful within a society and placed grassroots voices in the background. Yet the embodied interreligious relations of today have been characterized by the ability of everyday believers to talk back at religious leaders and to even construct alternative forms of religious authorities outside the conventional ones. We cannot actually conceptualize co-produced religions in the same way within the present day in a contemporary context because interreligious relations is always in flux. And of course, I agree that the ongoing interpretations of religious teachings today can change the past. Nevertheless, my question is, how do we utilize co-produced religions to understand the interreligious relations in the here and now, especially those practiced not through doctrinal discourses, but rather through the embodied everyday lives? In my context as a person who teach at a school where many students come from interreligious background, I have found that some of them have identified as people with multiple religious belongings, in which they rely on similarities between different religions in order to build their interreligious theological foundation. As an interreligious studies scholar, I have also been worried about using trans-religious similarities in building dialogue with each other, which does not critically interrogate the power structure that exists among those religions. Thus, while appreciating the potential richness of historical interreligiosity that can be found using co-produced religions, I wonder how co-produced religions engage with the question of power structure in the process of uncovering interreligious relationality in the histories of the three religions. Furthermore, with its emphasis on interdependency and commonalities, what is the place for religious differences within co-produced religions? To emphasize my point above, this phenomenon points to the need to take into account anthropological and sociological elements in addition to historical elements in the process of co-producing religions, especially when it is used within the contemporary context. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's Katharina. Appreciate those questions. Excuse me. Moving along, I know I'm moving along sort of quickly because I want to have time for breakout and Q&A responses as well. So we're going to move on to Muhammad Gamal Abdel Nur, who is next, and I will find you. There you are.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Hello, Axel. I'm talking from the UK, which is here 20 past 5. Okay, thank you so much for the keynote speeches and the contributions of all our contributors. I'm really fascinated by the keynotes lecture, and I completely see there's the using historical theology as a powerful corrective tools or analytical tools that may help us reimagine how those three faith traditions may relate to one another. Historical theology with me and its impact on my own understanding of Islam and Christianity is something that I've witnessed and experienced firsthand. I was trained at Al-Azhar University in Egypt since probably the age of 7. And throughout this time, I've been studying theology, philosophy, and Islamic studies in general. My own conception of theology over a period of roughly 15 years was that theology is something that is somehow contextless, that does not really get impacted or influenced by the historical factors or so, until I was introduced to the work of the renowned Muslim reformer Muhammad Abdu, who died in 1905, and his famous treatise, Risalat al-Tawheed, that is an Islamic theology, basically, and whereby he provides us with some sort of a historical coverage of how Muslim theology developed and this and that, which was really an eye-opener to how history really opens up and how history exposes the idea and the fact that theology has a history and that it does not operate in a vacuum. And that was really a game changer in how I imagined Muslim theological differences and this and that. And that imagination even doubled and deepened when I studied Catholic theology and then did my PhD in comparative theology, addressing questions of truth and salvation between Catholic Christianity and Sunni Islam, whereby again taking historical theology as my key approach helped me not only to understand the differences and the similarities between Islam and Christianity, but also really reimagining Islamic theology per se. The title of my book, which came out 3 years ago, is called A Comparative History of Catholic and Ash'ari Theologies of Truth and Salvation, Inclusive Minorities and Exclusive Majorities. The subtitle speaks our topic today, that is, I mean, how minoritarian versus majoritarian positions may really impact. I wouldn't say maybe. I use the word impact or influence quite cautiously here, as I believe, yeah, those historical positions do influence certain theological positions, but they don't determine and this basically raises another a really important point, that is the question of truth. If we believe or argue that historical theology is important and is a corrective, powerful tool, the next question is, what does this mean for the conception of truth? Is truth relative, or is it absolutist, or whatever? That's why I'm saying it. While it does influence, it does not really determine. It just helps us really filter and distinguish what is essential from what is historical or accidental. So as I said, I've witnessed this firsthand, and it did have a massive impact in how I imagine not only the Muslim tradition but also the Christian tradition. One other comment I have, if I have the time, that is on the pun, the Arabic pun or the foreign pun. Again, I completely see eye to eye with the presenters. I find the Bible providing a great background to Quran interpretation. I myself published an article a couple of months ago under the title of the Quran and the Bible, abrogation or confirmation. And here I basically grapple with I revisit the most dominant view that viewed how the Quran related to the Bible through the lens of abrogation. The Quran came to supersede or to abrogate the Bible completely, which did limit how Muslim or how Quran commentators may appeal to the Bible and take it as a sub-context that may really help Muslims make sense of much of what is in the Quran. And I basically question this very premise, and as opposed to that, I propose another Quranic concept that has received way less attention, despite the fact that it is mentioned way more frequently in the Quran. That is the concept of tasdeeq, or the concept of confirmation. More than 13 times, the Quran introduces itself as a confirmer rather than an abrogator to the Bible. And I really wonder how such a concept, despite its centrality and ubiquity throughout the Quran, was somehow sidelined, and yet another less central concept was taken as the mainstream. That is the concept of abrogation and alteration as well. That is tahrif. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. That's wonderful. We have two presenters left, and we'll begin with Marianne Moyart.
Thank you. Until recently, the dominant paradigm to study the history of early Christian relations was that of the so-called parting of the ways. Since Dunn proposed this paradigm, it has been nuanced, modified, and amended. Zooming in on Jewish-Christian relations, scholars began to recognize that the parting of the ways between Jews and Christians was a more gradual process than initially considered, and also varied from context to context. Nuances and emendations notwithstanding, this master narrative was one of separation, projecting Judaism and Christianity as clearly bounded traditions. This focus on separation, so prominent in the paradigm of the parting of the ways, resonates to my mind also with another master narrative, which was until recently also taken for granted, both in public opinion as well as in scholarly research, namely that of the so-called religio-secular division. Indeed, the dominant frame to understand modern relations between church and state has also been one of, or was also supposed to be one of, a gradual parting of the ways, with as an end result two clearly distinct spheres, the political and the religious. Be that this religious secular division, which also underlies the modern understanding of the so-called world religions in terms of bounded traditions, could it be that this religious secular division influenced the development of the master narrative of the parting of the ways, which this project seeks to counter? Perhaps this project may want to consider also exploring how the idea of the so-called religious secular divide relates to the archive that you say was co-produced by Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Indeed, you may want to explore not only how theologians make use, nolens volens, of the co-produced historical and hermeneutical archive in their thinking about God, but also how scholars operating in more secular disciplines are impacted by and contributed to this archive. I can see an interesting collaboration emerge here between this research project and the field of critical secularism and critical religious studies. Indeed, it is not only theologians in the different traditions that sometimes find it hard to relate to the idea of co-production. I think a similar problem presents itself in thinking through the relation between religion and the secular, as is exemplary in the often tensed relation between theology on the one hand and social and human sciences on the other hand. In contrast to the paradigm of the parting of the ways, the current research project shifts from a lens of separation to a lens of what I would call entanglement. This notion is mentioned twice in the paper, but I think it deserves an even more prominent place. The notion of entanglement implies an intimate prospect of histories being deeply interconnected and interwoven. It also suggests an element of unavoidability, of being wrapped up in each other's existence in an inescapable manner. And thus it implies relationality, dialogue and interaction, whether Jews, Muslims and Christians like this or not. They appropriated, borrowed, copied, rejected, claimed and reinterpreted and co-constructed concepts, taxonomies of difference, scriptural interpretations, ethical practices, legal formulations, epistemological criteria, but also rituals, symbols, bodily postures, and so forth. The exciting case studies presented here today are grounded mainly in detailed philological work and intertextual analysis. And I would hope, however, that the project of co-produced religions does not limit its study of co-production to the study of texts, as if that is the primary locus to gain insight in the co-produced nature of religious traditions. Instead, I hope that building on the material, ritual, and spatial turn in religion, scholars will also investigate other loci of co-production of meaning, loci that move beyond the textual fixation that has so long dominated the study of the history of religion, and that can also be understood as a form of co-produced religiosity. This remark, however, made me also ponder about the place of unequal power relations in this research project. Co-production of meaning can play out quite differently in a context where one tradition sets the norm while criminalizing adherents of another tradition, compared to a context, for example, where such a norm is perhaps absent. I think it would be interesting to further differentiate between different expressions of co-production. When is co-produced meaning the result of oppression? When is it the result of unintentional influence? When should we speak about strategic mimicry? These are just questions that come to my mind. I want to conclude my presentation with the question why I am so excited about this research project. The short answer is that I believe it has the potential of supporting a more constructive dialogical and a comparative theological way of doing theology. That is a way of doing theology that does not assume separation, but rather takes its departure in a sense of relationality. By centering the idea of co-produced religions, this project denaturalizes, historicizes theological or religious identitarian claims to purity, self-sufficiency, and originality. Comparative theologians associate such ideas with a desire for control, and as history shows, such ideas have given way to violent mechanisms to police, maintain, and reinforce the boundaries between religious communities, while simultaneously denying or masking their entanglement. And too often theologians have provided authorities with arguments to justify the policing of those constructed boundaries. And this with real consequences for social, political, religious, and economic relations. This research project shifts away from the fixation on separation and suggests that we speak of the history of these traditions as a shared history. This means giving up on the dangerous idea of pure identities. Identity is always permeated by difference or alterity. And from this perspective, the very idea of trying to protect one's core identity against contamination or perversion is illusory. To my mind, this approach can be quite liberative and creative, theologically speaking, because it means that Christians, and I would hope this also goes for Jews and Muslims, can unlearn some of their violent patterns of thinking and behaving vis-à-vis each other in their eagerness to protect boundaries and to explore the possibility of doing theology together, interreligiously. It may force theologians from these different traditions to ask, what does salvation mean when we conceive it as a shared goal and not as a gift given to some at the expense of others? It creates a space to do theology in the presence of the other and ponder how and where God has revealed God's self. This is to a large extent the work of comparative theology, which does not only assume the co-produced nature of traditions, but seeks to wholeheartedly contribute to the creative effort of theological co-production. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maureen. And we will now move to Klaus Vanskausch. Please, welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Axel, for bringing us together. Thank you for all those wonderful papers. I enjoyed all of them a lot and the whole event. So let me try to appreciate in the typical German way by making critical comments. So I start with David and Shlomo, which is the closest paper to my own expertise. So your very compound solution is really a wonderful solution, and it might really be true. But there are some obstacles which you have not yet shown how you overcome them, and there is a disadvantage of your solution. So your main witness, Muqatil, as you certainly know, among Muslims usually is understood as a good storyteller who has a lot of imagination. If he cannot solve a problem, he finds witnesses that solve the problem, which means that it might make sense to look deeper at Jewish sources, whether it really works out or not, which you might have done, and just in 5 minutes you couldn't show, but this is always what would come first to your mind, which wouldn't be a big problem if the result would not lead to something which is very compound, but still anti-Jewish. So in the end, it seems so that your research says again that Surah al-Baqarah is a kind of critique of Judaism. And this can be understood in another way, as you might know that this is very much debated in current research. So let me advertise the recent dissertation of one of my students, Wahid Mafdavi-Mer. I try to put it in the chat that you can look at it if you're interested. So he tries to read Surah al-Baqarah as something which interacts with Christian apologetic ideas, anti-Jewish ideas, and try to show how the Quran modifies that kind of Christian anti-Judaism. So I mentioned this because your whole project seemed to want to say that all three religions are co-produced. That's why I wondered why in both case studies you only look at two traditions, not in all the three. And both case studies might become much more exciting if you look at all three traditions. For example, the first case study, of course, is very legitimate only to look at Christianity and Judaism because it's mainly talking of it partly. talking of a time before the occurrence of Islam. But it would be interesting to look at the Quran, and especially at the anti-Christological debates of the Quran in a way that shows that the Quran is discussing that kind of mutual accusation of hypocrisy in both religions. We can understand, for example, Surah, 457, that's a verse on the cross, in a way that it's commenting those Jewish accusations that you quote in those Christian Jewish debates. And we can understand, for example, the comments on Jesus' miracles in the Quran, and that the Quran is so much insisting that Jesus has legacy to perform those miracles, as a rejection of exactly those accusations that you were referring to from the Christian side against Judaism. So if you, in both projects, if you bring the third religion in, if you do what you say, what is your project about, it would become more exciting, and it would be more difficult to keep the anti-Jewish tone in the second case study. Which leads me to the general critique of the concept. So my problem with David's and Katharina's wonderful idea is that I get the impression that their way out of the problem of historicism is a bit too radical or too easy. So, of course, I see that the liberal Protestant tradition in inventing the essence of Christianity is a big problem, or can be understood as a problem. And I understand that it's difficult to say this is Christianity, this is not. But okay, I'm a Christian dogmatic scholar. We in Germany define Christian dogmatics, and I choose a Protestant colleague, that's the Heiko Schulz, for example, philosopher in Frankfurt. He defines Christian dogmatics as the discipline which shows what in truth is Christianity. So there seems to be a lot of scholars who try to find out what in truth Christianity is. I understand that from a perspective of a historian, that doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's also a bit of funny. But I understood, and that's why I appreciate your project so much. That's the dialogue of theology and history. And this kind of dialogue, it would be very exciting to have also the question, why might it be also legitimate that me as a Christian theologian, for example, simply does not understand the German Christians as a relevant part of the true understanding of Christianity. So there are parts of our history, like many Muslims saying today, ISIS is not really Islam. I think there needs to be some way of integrating that in your project. And that makes it difficult to say Christianity, Islam, Judaism is everything that has ever been lived or thought or claimed to be Muslim, Christian, Jewish. So, of course, there is a way to say this, but if you don't want to up in a relativism on the normative level, which is problematic, you also need a way out how to guide your question, our responsibility to choose from the archive. So I see that I like very much the idea of filling the archive with much more examples. I see from the case studies that it works very well out. But I have I'm afraid because of the case studies, also because of what is not in the case studies, and leads to something which is still problematic while and at the same time it wants to be neutral. I think so. We should not. So the way out of the double contingency, which is a result of a heresy of Troll's paradigm, or the kind of historicism you seem to deal with, would of course not be a kind of metaphysical or archimedical point, but maybe some more systematic contingents, reflections, which can guide us to have certain questions, like the questions that I had in the beginning for your two projects. But this is not to say that this is that anything is bad in what you're doing. I appreciate a lot. I learned a lot from it, and it's just trying to bring my perspective as a systematic theologian to it, which, and I enjoyed a lot learning from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Klaus. So what we're going to do now, everyone, is break out into mini groups, breakout sessions. What I encourage you to do in your breakout sessions, in which each of you, I think, will have one of the participants as well, in addition to this discussion, but take this time and opportunity to, if you have a question, to narrow down your question to a short, succinct question of 20 seconds or something like that. That then when we come back, we'll have a Q&A with all the panelists. This is a good opportunity to talk about what you've learned and discuss it, but also come up with that succinct question you want to ask as well. And we're going to be breaking out right now. Tom, I think Tom's going to take care of it. Thank you. Go ahead. See you back here in a few minutes.
Give me 1 second because people.
Okay, it was a short session, but we went out of time for some Q&A, and we'll just do this as in a typical way. Raise your hand and either digitally or with your, we'll actually do it digitally because I can't see everyone. And we will, you can ask your question. So let's see. Go ahead. Is it Jillian Weiss? Yeah, please.
Yes, Jillian. Hi. In our breakout group, a question emerged. I suggested, but the others thought fine, which was if the PIs could say something about the origins or the genealogy of this research project and the kind of work that it lays its roots in. I'm thinking, obviously, in part about David's own work, exemplified, for example, by the compilation of essays published in the volume Neighboring Faiths, or the work of, is it Daniel Boyarin, on the first centuries of the Common Era. So could that be addressed?
Please.
I can say something very, very brief and then pass that on to Katharina, who has a much more elaborate sense of the genealogy. And all I'm going to say is I was reading Times Echo on the plane back from somewhere last night. Times Echo is a book about music and the Holocaust and modern memory. And he talks about music as a reservoir of memory. And he cites Walter Benjamin and the past being full of fragments of hope, etc., that can be recovered for the present. And I suddenly realized that in my dissertation, Communities of Violence, I had cited those texts by Benjamin. And yet here I was doing a project 30 years later without even remembering those texts from Benjamin, in which in some ways I was animated by those kinds of ideas, only in some ways, which is just to say any genealogy that I could ever come up with would be very partial and the subject of the arbitrariness of my own memory and attention at this moment. And that's why Katharina is in a much better position to say something meaningful.
I'm not sure I am, and I see also John Pawlikowski raising his hand. I can only say that I think, it was the same for me. I was working on first of all on Jewish-Christian relations and Jewish-pagan Christian relations in antiquity, then moving on to more images of Islam in medieval Latin Christianity, and every time I felt a bit unsatisfied with what I found there, only taking one perspective and then changing perspectives, compare perspectives. And I think in the conversation with David, we found that co-production could be a more powerful tool to approach, the interrelatedness, but also the a stable ambivalence in all of that. And this is also related to what we discussed concerning the papers of today, that I think our goal is not to solve anything for the moment, but more to explain, to really understand, and to say that there are potentials. Sometimes there are also potentials to do it better, but not, I mean, it's not that we would rewrite the history of the hermeneutics between the religions. But yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. John Palikowski, please.
Well, just to, I think the issue of revelation and the relationship, possible relationship to history has to be explored more, because there really seemed to be a real tension between the two still continuing in Christianity. And I cite a comment made to me some years ago by the late Cardinal Francis George of Chicago, somewhat in response to my own thinking, saying that if we have to choose between revelation and history, we're obligated always to choose revelation. And the other thing, kind of related, I would say, is I think that a role of liturgy and worship has to be explored here, because certainly in the Catholic tradition, there is an understanding that the experience of worship often produces theological insights. And for example, the belief in the assumption, the so-called supposed widespread belief in assumption, in the doctrine of the assumption, led to it becoming a doctrine. But that came out of piety, not out of theological reflection. So,
I mean, if I may jump in here, it is absolutely important and true that we have to include also lived religion, and we do. If you have a look at the website, we have case studies on rituals, on pilgrimage, on prayers, and so it's really important, and it is something that we do. I think what is perhaps a bit more difficult task is to understand how theology works, what work theology does in those lived religion cases. So perhaps for today, in order to understand the relationship between history and theology, the focus on text was the easiest one, let's say.
And on the very difficult first question you posed, I would never argue with the late Cardinal George, but
I would.
But I think that was just a pious confession, not necessarily a. But on, I think Katharina and I would both say that we are working in our own project to show that many different strands of the history of Revelation and its reception, its creation, its interpretation, understood and understand Revelation as historical, so that the opposition between Revelation and historical that Cardinal George is phrasing is actually not one that the traditions themselves, whether we be speaking of well, all three of these faith traditions, didn't themselves I'm going to say complexify.
Thank you. Michaela, is that, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so it was really great to listen to you. And my question continues a little bit what Don Pawlikowski was asking, but I'm interested in the question of authority. So Shahad Ahmad is asking what is Islam authoritatively? And so I'm wondering does this question what's the role of authority in the making of the three traditions? Does this play any role in your project?
That's an interesting question. I think that authority mostly try to create those lines of development. You can also see it in the genealogies, and so perhaps in a sense our project tries to challenge this authoritative narrative, but at the same time, those are also, I would say, this is also some kind of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity created by authorities. So it's just one part of the whole picture.
And I just would add that question relates very well to Laylatul Fitriya's comment, I think. And I know this is a wrong, the very a bad kind of argument, but I would just say that we do attend very closely, I think, to questions of power, and in our much larger statement of what co-production is, which is coming out in the Harvard Theological Review. This wasn't really about co-production, the talk today. It was about what history and theology can offer each other, partly because the scholars of the Harvard Theological Review who reviewed our larger paper said, okay, now show us the constructive work. What would constructive work look like? And so we wanted to be a little more explicit about that. But I think the issues about authority, the issues about power, that these are really something very important.
And in that regard, if any of the other respondents on that question of authority, theologians, scholar practitioners want to respond, that might be there. There's some to add too, but there's no need to either. Okay, well, we're actually then at time here. What we're going to be doing next is we'll probably make this recording available at a later date. I will also send publication data and information of any related papers to registrants at the time, so you're aware of it. And of course, be sure to check out the website, Co-Produced Religions, which you can easily find it by Googling it. I forgot what it is, Co-Produced, but it's easy to find. I'm trying to find it. But thank you very much to all our guests and respondents and panelists.
Thank you very much for all your comments.
Great.
Thank you.
I will send one additional email at a later date to all registrants with any information to share. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.